Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. One of the things you wanted to consider in this particular conference is particular ideals. We say that a lot of East Asian countries care about improving the language level of both their faculty and their students. When we say that there are countries that want to do this, by definition, we mean that we want it to improve at the systemic level. That is, these things are being done in education ministries in larger groups rather than at the individual level. And the question being posed to us by this conference is, what role might assessment have in supporting these ideals? Because as many people like to think, standardized tests have lots of negative consequences. Or the second strand of our conference, performance-based tests. Well, trying to do performance-based tests is not very practical. Your teachers, you don't like correcting long essays. If we had to do face-to-face speaking tests to get them to talk, you actually need lots of people to be there talking to them. Or to take the third strand of our conference, proficiency scales. What role do proficiency scales have in supporting these ideals that we have? Well, in my talk today, I'd like to cover these things in three different sections. In the first section of my talk, I'd like to give us a way to think about policy. In the second section of my talk, I'd like to give us a way to think a little bit about assessment. And finally, in the third part, we'll try to put those two together, mix them up, and see what we get. Okay, so let's move right on to the first part, thinking first of all about policy. And most of what I want to say about policy is actually from a thinker in education policy called Thomas Green. And I intentionally chose Thomas Green because he's dead now, so he can't be in the audience to tell me that I've read him wrong. Okay, but the reason actually that I'm choosing Thomas Green is because he has written a few things about what happens or how it is that different ideals can come into conflict. Okay? Here's one thing. Here's a possible ideal we can think of. Equal educational opportunity. Quite often, we do like to have these in our education systems. So I'm going to give you a definition up here in a minute, and you tell me whether you think this is a decent definition of equal educational opportunity. Equal educational opportunity is to give to each an education that is as good as that provided for everyone else. Do you think that's a good definition of equal educational opportunity? Yeah, I see a few heads nodding, and because you just had coffee, I'll presume that doesn't mean you're nodding off to sleep. Okay, so that does sound like a good definition of equal educational opportunity. But let me give you a second definition and tell me whether you think this is a good definition of the same thing. To give an education that is uniquely suited and best for each individual and at the same time. Do you think that is a good definition? You think that's a good definition as well. Okay? But if you take a look at these two definitions, you'll realize it's probably impossible for you to get both of these at the same time. You can try, you'll probably get one more than the other. In other words, one of the ways that our ideals can come into conflict is that they can actually have a conflict of meaning. So even though we share the same ideal, we might actually be thinking different things about what this ideal means. Okay? Let's move on to a second way that our ideals can come into conflict. And for this one, I'd like to have an opinion poll, so I do need to see, I need to see hands going up, or if you want to shout, you can shout too. Here, see whether you agree with this. The state should give to each child an education that is as good as that provided for everyone else. Do you like this? Let's try that again. Okay, people who think this is a good idea, raise your hands. Most people think this is a pretty good idea. Okay, a lot of you here are policymakers. A lot of you are decision makers. You think it's a good idea that we need to give everyone a good education. Here's the second thing. A lot of you here are also parents. Do you agree with this? As a parent, given the opportunity, you would choose the best teacher for your child. Most of you have your hands raised, and then the rest of you are just liars. Okay, if your child, if there are 3 people teaching maths in that year, and you know one of them is better, you're going to choose that teacher for your child. Now, I've already called some of you liars, so I probably shouldn't also call you hypocrites, because I don't think you are. You agreed with the first one. You agreed equality is a good thing. But on another level, you don't think equality is a good thing. You'd rather have your child have the best teacher possible. In other words, another way that our ideals can come into conflict is that they can belong to different levels of aggregation. Some ideals reside at higher levels of aggregation, such as we need to have equality in education. But other ideals play out best at a lower level of aggregation. As a parent, you want the best for your child. He actually also talks about a third possible way that policy or ideals can come into conflict. And this third one is, oops, that's not the button, is a conflict of implementation. And to just give you an example of this, in the United States, they think, for example, that some groups of people are sufficiently disadvantaged that you want to give them some special support. But in order to give them special support, you can't just put that money into the classroom, because people who don't deserve it will get it. So the way you do it is by pulling out these students. But apparently, if you pull students out of their classrooms, it's very disruptive, and it does not actually help with their education. So you have an ideal that's good, but because of the difficulties of implementation, you'll actually come into conflict with some other ideal. Okay, so our ideals can come into conflict in at least 3 different ways. A conflict in meaning, a conflict in the level of aggregation, and a conflict in terms of implementation. And that is actually where policy comes in. We need policy when we have 2 different goods that come into conflict. For example, in our company, we have a policy related to taking vacation leave. Why do we need a policy like that? Because on the one hand, it's good for employees to be in the office so that they can do work. On the other hand, it's also good for employees to take some time off so that they don't kill themselves and get burned out and so on and so forth. Both of these are good things. You can't maximize one because, if you make them work every single day of the year, you're going to have no employee left by the end of the year. If they just go on leave all the time, well, that doesn't work either. So you need to have a policy because you have 2 conflicting goods that you need to balance out, right? We don't have a policy about how much time students should study in relation to the amount of time they should spend killing people, okay? Because those are not 2 competing goods. One is good, one is bad. We know they should not kill people. We don't have a policy to try to balance those 2. Now that tells you something about policy, because policy is trying to make the best of 2 things that conflict. You're never going to maximize anything, and therefore what you're trying to do is to come up with something that on the whole, in general, at the very high level, generally works. Something that we can all live with. Okay? With that in mind, we actually come up with what I would call a policy paradox. As we have seen earlier, the idea of equality is something that actually happens at a higher level of aggregation. And if policy is about things that are on the whole, in general, those are the kinds of things that policy should be dealing with. We've also seen earlier that a concept like excellence is something that actually is something we work on a more local level, not the kinds of things that we tend to do policy on. But ironically, here's a statement, and in fact, before that statement, equity, on the other hand, a third E, is one of those things that happens and works up and down the scale. We want to be fair and just, whether at high levels, at middle levels, or at low levels of aggregation. But here's a possible place where the paradox comes in. Thomas Green says, policies in pursuit of educational excellence are more likely to produce gains in equity than policies in pursuit of equality are likely to produce excellence. Okay, that's a mouthful. Policies in pursuit of educational excellence are more likely to produce gains in equity than policies in pursuit of equality are likely to produce excellence. If you try to put equality at the level at the low level, you're going to come into problems. If you try to come up with the idea of equality is the most important thing in the classroom, all you need to do is ignore the bright students, then all of them at the end of the day will be equally poor and you have equality. Whereas if your policies are actually targeting excellence, you're more likely to produce gains in equity. If everyone uniformly becomes good, then there's no inequality, there's no injustice. So we do have a paradox in our hands because excellence does not lend itself to policy very well. It's very hard to legislate excellence. On the other hand, that's what we all want to legislate, which makes it very, very, very difficult. If you're willing to accept Thomas Green's ideas about these, then it entails or implies a particular way of approaching policy. Okay? With that in mind, which one of these two do you think should we be dealing with in coming up with policy? Should we be coming up with a small effort to achieve gains at high levels of aggregation? Or should we have a large effort to achieve gains at low levels of aggregation? I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. People who think the first is the correct answer, raise your hand. People who think the second one is what we need to work on, raise your hand. And lots of people who don't want to raise their hands because it's always safer to do it that way. In fact, if you take the logical reasoning behind what Tom Green has said, what we care about is the first one. Because policy deals with things at a high level rather than at a low level. Does that make sense? In policy, we want the aggregate. We want the educational system, not about the individuals. And all things being equal, we'd prefer things that require a small amount of effort rather than something that requires a large amount of effort, because efficiency is always a good thing in running systems. Here's a second question. With that in mind, when you're coming up with policy, do you try to maximize a specific benefit, or should you instead minimize a specific injustice? People who think it's the first. Oh dear. The second. If you follow the logic of Tom Green, it is actually the second. Remember, policies are about balancing two goods. If you try to maximize one of them, there's some other good that's going to be given short shrift. And therefore, a more proper and humble aim for policy would be try to just make sure that real egregious inequalities and injustices are not done. That you actually try to minimize specific injustice. Okay? So much for that. Let's move on and talk a little bit about assessment. Well, in assessment, let's say we do care about excellence. In this particular case, what we're trying to be excellent in is learning. Learning a language in this particular case. And I have to say, assessment does not always have learning in mind. Okay? For example, here are some assessment practices I'm going to show you. A lot of people think I'm Vietnamese, but I'm actually ethnically Chinese. So here is me as a young man going to school in the Philippines. And I'm going to list for you a couple of assessment practices that my teachers have used. And I need you to tell me whether you think they're good or bad assessment practices. Okay, now in England, where I live now, we have a technical word we use when we disagree with something. Okay, the technical word is boo. And when we agree, it's yay. Okay, so I need you to say boo or yay. Okay, here's the first one that my teacher did. Find some obscure information just to make the test hard. Boo! Nobody did the reading, so let's give them a quiz. Boo! But I'm sure you've done it yourself. In the Philippines, we really like basketball, so give students extra points for going to the game. We have a lot to learn about assessment here. Give extra questions for bonus points. Ooh, we also need to talk about that one. What about just making a test that most people will pass? Boo! What about just a test that most people will fail? Boo as well. Okay, even in the classroom, when we do assessment, you can actually have a lot of bad assessment practice. Okay, in fact, here's a way for you to figure out, those of you who are teachers, whether your teaching and your assessing is learning oriented or not. Okay, I'm going to show you a question. You know, if you answer this, the answer to this question tells you whether your teaching and assessing is learning oriented or not. After a day at school, which of the statements below are you more likely to think of? Here they are. If you are not a liar, the one you're more likely to think of is the first one. But if you're really being learning oriented, you're more likely to be thinking of the second one. And this has implications, because if you're thinking of the first one, this is how you'd go about doing things. You have a prepared lesson ahead of time. You deliver it. And then because you've delivered it, you say, well done, and you give yourself a gold star. Job done, you know, I'm okay, I can go home now. But if you think in terms of today, what your student learned, what you're going to do is take a look at their performance, observe them, decide, well, what does that tell me about my student, whether they've learned or not? You're probably going to list it down because you have lots of students and you can't remember every single one of them. And then you're going to give them feedback. And you're going to adjust your teaching to make them work on something that is more appropriate to their level. This feedback loop will make your assessment and your teaching practice more learning oriented. In fact, this is what we just call teaching. But if you look at it, assessment is intricately bound into it. Teaching and assessment become one. Now here's the thing. None of you are actually teaching the same student from when they're 4 entering school to the day they finish university. So even if you do a good job of this, it will not be sufficient because the following year they'll go into the next class and then the teacher will have a heck of a time trying to figure out where everyone is. And that is why in addition to classroom assessment, you'd probably want, you know, in the classroom, what you have is different students and you do try to make it appropriate for each student. But for the following year, you need something more. In order to know, you know, how these people are doing compared to people in the next class, or people, you know, in this year to the next year, you would need something like an external reference that's well constructed, so that you are able to say, this is where they are, next year this is where they should be, the year after that this is where they should be. You need to be able to combine classroom assessment, which is horizontal, what you do on a day-to-day basis, with large-scale assessment, which is vertical, which is something you do at a more macro level. Okay? In fact, if you put those two things together, then it all makes sense. So, on the one hand, nope, go back. On the one hand, you do have something like the Common European Framework, which could be the basis for you to develop curricula that make sense and that are well aligned to one another from one year to the next. That's the basis for you to come up with your objectives and your syllabuses. Once that's developed, you can actually, in the classroom, make micro adjustments on a day-to-day basis to help promote learning. But at particular points in the process, you also have an external exam that tells you how you're doing in real absolute terms And if this is all working together, you have a cycle here, you have a cycle here, that will end up promoting learning. And indeed, what you'd want to do is to make sure that all the parameters surrounding your practice are geared and focused on learning. So we've talked a little bit about how to think about policy, and we've thought a little bit about how we can make assessment focus on learning. Let's move on to the third part, where we try to see what happens when you put these two things together. Now here what I have for you is an education system of a kind. The national level, the regional level, the district level, the school classroom, and the student level. You may call it different names within your systems, but you get the idea. If you follow Tom Green's ideas, which I gave you a hint of earlier, at what levels do you think should policymakers look at assessment results? Up there or down there? Policymakers are cared most of all about their education systems, in which case they should focus on up there, at higher levels of aggregation. Okay? Policy works at high levels in general terms, not at the lower levels. And something good happens when policymakers actually focus on the higher levels. If you think that policymakers just want assessment results at the highest levels, that actually means you don't have to test every single student in the system. You could actually just sample them. Tomorrow in the first plenary, they will be talking about a survey-type test, something similar to PISA, where you're actually just sampling people. If you sample, you'll end up using less effort rather than when you try to test every single person in your system. It'll be much, much cheaper too. And because you're sampling, because every student's score does not necessarily reflect on them, there'll be less teaching to the test. You know, at some point in the year, someone will come, sample and test some students, because teachers are not necessarily expecting it will cover them or their students. They'll be teaching as they should, and they won't be tempted to engage in these other kinds of behaviors that subvert learning. So you can see that if you actually set your policy in a way that makes sense, it can be cheaper, it can work better, it can help learning a lot more. Some of you, of course, will think, I could come up with a general rule, making it a policy matter, that's actually at the bottom of this thing. You could think, for example, about coming up with a rule that says 95% of all your students need to be proficient. This is what the United States did in their No Child Left Behind legislation. They made sure to test every single student and said, in every school, 95% of the students need to be proficient. You give them a quota. Now you know what happens when you give people a quota. They will give you the quota. Okay? You tell the teachers to give you 95% proficient, and the teachers will give you 95% proficient. And that is in fact what happened. That is in fact what you'd call maximizing benefits. And they would go for a quota, and that is what happened, for example, in the Atlanta public schools in the United States. There's unethical behavior across every level. What the teachers had was test correction parties. Do you know what their test correction parties were? All the teachers sat together in the room and changed all the answers for the students so that they all got high scores. So all those people whose photos you see there, in fact there are more of them, there are probably 20, 30 of them, are all either sitting in jail or dead. Of natural causes. There was no death penalty. If you engage in policy that's about maximizing benefits, you're probably more likely to come up with these big headline announcements as well. This is what we're going to reach at some point. And you know what happens when you make big pronouncements like that? You expose yourself to political risk. Because then suddenly, if you don't meet it, you know, a minister looks bad. So what do? You do other things to make sure the quota is met. Right? And that is actually what education systems do. Atlanta did that. What Michigan did was, in order to continue to receive money from the National Education Department in the United States, we've run out of batteries there, so I guess I'll have to stand here. Because they wanted to keep receiving money from the national government, they just redefined their standards downwards so that everyone suddenly was proficient. Does that help learning? It does not help learning. Whereas, in fact, in place of trying to maximize benefits, you can follow Tom Green and say you want to minimize injustice. If, for example, instead of saying 95% of people need to be proficient, what if instead you said it as, thank you very much. What if instead of saying 95% of everyone should be proficient, you said it as, let's figure out after we sample who are the bottom 15%, and let's send people in to actually help them get better. I can tell you that actually costs less money. And if every year you focus on the bottom 10% and help them get better, eventually everyone in your education system will be much better. That is what Tom Green is trying to say. If you're being more modest in your goals in that fashion, or you phrase them in a way that is trying to minimize injustice, you'll end up achieving more good at the end of the day. Oh. In addition to 95% proficient, the United States did something even better. They decided to make it an accountability system. That is to say, if you don't reach it, the teachers are in trouble. This is actually a gross misdiagnosis, okay? If you're trying to sanction teachers, what you're really trying to say is that the teachers had the ability to make the students pass, but deliberately chose to not let them pass. In other words, they were just doing it to spite you. Which is probably not what teachers are doing. In other words, the reality is they failed because they don't know how to make the students pass. And if they don't know how to make students pass, sanctioning them is not going to help. In fact, if you sanction them, what it does is it creates a culture of fear. And you know what happens when there's a culture of fear? You stop talking. You know, if there are any problems, you hide in hopes that, you know, it will not come out. If any system wants to improve, it needs to have that feedback loop working. And remember what I showed you earlier? That loop about learning? If there's a lot of fear going on, that learning feedback loop will get disrupted. Which tells you that a system based on accountability and sanctions is ultimately not learning-oriented. It might look learning-oriented in that we're holding everyone to high standards. But ultimately, that is you using assessment as an accountability tool rather than as a learning tool. So let's do a recap. We have this ideal. We do want to improve the English language capabilities of our citizens. And we want to do it at the level of education systems. What does assessment have to do with it? What role can it play? And if you are willing to grant what Tom Green has said, here are the few things you would keep in mind. You'd always focus on learning. Every single policy you come up with should ask, how does this contribute to learning? Because some things you come up with might sound like they're related, but they're not. Second, you want to assess at the appropriate level of aggregation. What an education ministry needs is to be able to see nationally, regionally, maybe even at the school level whether we're doing good. The classroom level and the individual level, that could be idiosyncratic. A student was not feeling well that day. There's a lot of noise in there. That's not something for policy to deal with. That's something for the school doctor to deal with. And finally, you want to act to minimize injustice. By this, I do not mean that you come up with more modest policy goals, but rather that you set policy goals that give due recognition to how systems and teachers and people actually work and think. Because if you set them correctly, you will find at the end of the day, you end up achieving a lot more. I hope this starts a conversation, and I hope you grab me after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gad Lim. And now I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Only of the softball variety, I'm told.
So please raise your hand if you have a question for Dr. Gad Lim. No?
Either what I said made perfect sense or made no sense at all. Thank you very much.